the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
It's a fascinating thing because I think for us as Catholics, we might think or be tempted to think that, confession, it feels like the penalty box or something, and people are just terrified of the idea and you maybe don't believe, why do I need to confess my sins to a priest anyway? There is some of that, and we're going to get into that. There is some difficulty catechetically around that, and you're finding, but I always found as a high school theology teacher, we'd have, maybe once a quarter, there'd be a Friday that we'd have adoration in our school chapel and an opportunity for our kids to go to confession for the teens. And just being presented with that invitation and that opportunity, and we do a little teaching and catechesis on why it was important. I was amazed at the percentage of even the kids you knew, that weren't really, it's not like they were living the faith, every weekend necessarily, right? To put it, a certain way. They really were drawn to the sacrament. So, what do you think, in some ways, right? So just to read a couple of the stats you gave. So 63% of Catholics, your study found, say they can just go directly to God for forgiveness without a priest. That number jumps to 81% if they haven't been since, as you mentioned, they went as children. But they're extremely motivated, those who have a desire to return, by this desire for mercy. How do pastors and parish leaders parse through your study and some of those findings and respond catechetically? Like, what would you encourage them if they're listening to do, or even just Catholics in the pews, to invite people back to the sacrament if they are open to it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, for one, this is a study that needs to be studied, right? So it's not a quick read. There are some quick headlines and some obvious points, but then what you do is, I think you try to frame a conversation around understanding why people go, and use that in your conversations to people who don't go. So, for example, the number one reason that people don't go is because they feel they can just pray directly to God, right? They don't need a priest. And while that, of course, is true, there are graces that come from this. And we asked about fruits, for example, like the people who go, what are the fruits that you experience? And there was a lot around knowing and feeling, that they've been forgiving, right? And having that assurance of the absolution is great. But beyond that, there are these fruits of interior healing and peace and help in their spiritual development that they feel, and even help in when you're facing temptations, right? So those are fruits that I don't think people who don't go to confession really think about. That confession helps you. You receive graces to be able to help you in your spiritual development and in your relationship with Christ. I think we need to communicate about that, and it can be communicated through simple conversations, of course, from the pulpit. But I do think that there may be a need. I mean, not that we want to add another program, but maybe a series or just some sort of resources around overcoming some of the barriers that we see that Catholics who don't go to confession have. And these are also the Catholics that want to come back, or they're interested in coming back. But anyway, so that's one area, right? So helping the non-goers, as it were, see what some of the the whole range of fruits that come from going to confession. And then I think there are certain barriers that they've identified that can be addressed. I mean, you referred to it earlier as a penalty box, right? So there are a couple of findings around the discomfort associated with the sacrament, two of which were embarrassment at naming their sins out loud. And the other one was just discomfort with the process itself. It's not knowing what the process is. It's that they know it and they're not comfortable with it, which is somewhat by design, I would think, right? But I think it's acknowledging that these are barriers and acknowledging that these are reasons that people don't go, and addressing them in some way, trying to help them see that it's okay, right? It's okay that you come back and you confess the same sins. We're not going to judge you for that.
Yeah, I think speaking to it and really helping reframe it, I think, as this is the place where God's mercy is encountered, and, really helping people connect in some ways with what that mercy is. Like there's that great story from, who's one of the saints? Was it St. Margaret Mary Alacoque or something, where the bishop didn't believe, or she was receiving messages from Jesus about the Sacred Heart or something, and the bishop didn't believe that she was receiving these messages. So he said, great, next time you go that Jesus appears to you, ask him what I confessed in my last confession. And so she goes and Jesus does appear to her again, and she asks him the question. She comes back to the bishop, and the bishop said, Margaret Mary, like, what did Jesus say? I confessed in my last confession. And Margaret Mary looks kind of embarrassed, almost like sort of sheepish, and isn't really answering. He kind of keeps pressing her for an answer. And she said, I don't really know how to explain it. And she said, well, what did he say? And she said, he says he doesn't remember. And the bishop believed her. Because this is the Jesus that we encounter in confession, is the Jesus who literally, would say, I don't remember. And I was struck by, in your study, we have, time for like one last kind of question, but you mentioned that using Harvard's validated index for human flourishing, that regular confession participants scored noticeably higher, which speaks to, I think, the spiritual, we're a body soul composite, and it speaks to the spiritual healing that's going on there. Can you just talk about that for a second? I thought that was fascinating.
Yes. No, I was very pleased with the outcome, I guess. You do approach these very objectively when you're designing them, but then when you're looking at the analysis and you're hoping to see certain patterns. By the way, one quick pattern to note is that everyone scored higher. These are mass going Catholics, right? Monthly or more often for the most part. All of them scored higher than the benchmark level for flourishing. But there's a very clear relationship between frequency of going to confession and scoring higher on human flourishing, where those who confess regularly scored the highest by a fair amount, and certainly higher than those who don't go, which just speaks to, they're also Catholics, those are also Catholics who have a more well-rounded spiritual life, right? They pray regularly, they go to adoration, they're involved in Bible studies or Bible reading, devotions and all of that, right? And so all of that, I think what we're seeing here, it contributes to just greater human flourishing and happiness. And, like I said, I was very, pleased to see that kind of outcome. And I think it's an important one.
That was the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio. The best way to listen to the Best of the Week is on the Relevant Radio app, free and always free. Download and share the #1 free Catholic app today in the App Store.